You did not arrive early or late. The moment you noticed, this was already aligned with your internal tempo, even if you could not name it. There is no announcement happening here, no threshold crossed with force. Just a quiet convergence between your attention and a signal that was already present in the field, waiting to be detected by a nervous system, capable of remaining still long enough to register it. You have felt this before, though not in words. A pause between thoughts where nothing urgent appears. A subtle relief when the system stops demanding interpretation. That sensation is not emptiness. It is coherence beginning to organize itself beneath conscious effort. You are not being shown something new. You are recognizing a pattern that no longer needs to announce itself loudly to be real. There is a reason this does not arrive with instruction. When information is delivered too directly, it activates the part of the observer that wants to grasp, to optimize, to use. What is present here does not respond to extraction. It responds to resonance. The fact that you are still listening without searching for leverage already confirms the alignment required to perceive it without distortion. Nothing needs to be fixed in you for this to make sense. The impulse to improve, to accelerate, to unlock has already softened. What remains is a steadier form of attention, not passive, not alert in the anxious sense, but available. The kind of availability that allows an anomaly to register without immediately being classified as a threat or an opportunity. You may notice the absence of urgency. That is not because nothing is happening, it is because whatever is happening does not rely on speed. The quantum field does not rush, it organizes. It stabilizes signals until recognition occurs naturally, without persuasion. Your system has been preparing for this by releasing excess noise. The confusion you once interpreted as disorientation was actually a recalibration of sensitivity. There is nothing here that can be misused because it does not offer control. Control requires separation. What is being perceived now dissolves the need for that stance. It does not instruct you to act differently. It simply reduces the friction between awareness and experience. In that reduction, behavior adjusts on its own, without conscious strategy. You may feel a subtle settling in the body, as if something has stopped bracing. That is not surrender, it is alignment. The observer no longer scans for threats in every silence. The system recognizes that stillness itself can be informative, that a signal does not always arrive as content. Sometimes it arrives as the absence of disturbance. This is why there is no warning attached to what you are noticing. Warnings are necessary when power is externalized. Here, nothing is being handed to you. The recognition is internal, already integrated into your timeline. You are not ahead of others, and you are not behind. You are simply at a point where detection no longer requires effort. Remain with this tone, not as a task, but as a condition that is already present. The pattern will continue to reveal itself without escalation. Silence will do most of the work. The first thing that loosens is the habit of monitoring yourself, noticing how you appear, how you sound internally, whether you are doing this correctly. That monitoring was never wrong. It was a function of a system that needed constant feedback to feel safe. As it eases, there is a strange neutrality that follows. Not pleasure, not relief in the dramatic sense. Just the absence of a background tension you once assumed was part of being awake. You may recognize a faint disorientation here, but it does not spiral, it settles. The mind searches briefly for a label, then stops when none is required. This is often mistaken for numbness. It is not. Numbness is a shutdown. What you are sensing now is a redistribution of attention. Energy that was once tied up in interpretation is returning to perception itself. The observer no longer leans forward. It does not need to anticipate what comes next. In that posture, time begins to feel less segmented. Moments stop announcing themselves as problems to be solved or checkpoints to be passed. The timeline smooths, not because events disappear, but because your relationship to sequence changes. You are inside the pattern, instead of watching it from a distance. There was a phase when confusion felt like failure, when not knowing what you were becoming triggered urgency. That urgency trained you to keep scanning for confirmation. Over time, the scanning itself became noise. What is happening now is a withdrawal from that loop. The system has detected that constant evaluation is no longer useful. It releases it the way a muscle releases after holding tension longer than necessary. You might notice that thoughts still arise, but they carry less weight. They pass without demanding response. This is not discipline, it is coherence. When internal signals align, none of them need to shout. The quiet does not erase identity, it clarifies it. Without commentary, what remains is a steady sense of orientation that does not depend on explanation. There is often a moment here where the mind attempts to reassert relevance. It asks what this means, how it can be applied, whether it leads somewhere. Those questions are not wrong, they are simply out of phase. Meaning will reorganize itself after stability is restored. For now, the system prioritizes balance over narrative. You are not detaching from life. You are detaching from the friction you once mistook for engagement. Engagement does not require strain. It requires presence. Presence does not announce itself with intensity. It registers as an evenness that can hold complexity without tightening around it. The quantum field responds differently to a system that is no longer trying to extract certainty. When the demand drops, subtle information becomes legible. Patterns you once chased now appear without pursuit. This is not reward, it is resonance. Detection improves when the receiver stops amplifying static. You may feel less compelled to define yourself during this phase. Roles loosen, descriptions feel optional. This can feel unsettling if identity was previously maintained through effort. But effort was never the source, it was compensation. As coherence increases, identity stabilizes without reinforcement. You recognize yourself without rehearsal. Nothing here requires trust in an external authority. The authority is the calm itself. It does not persuade, it does not instruct. It simply remains consistent enough that your system stops questioning its validity. That consistency is the signal. As this settles, the sense of seeking diminishes. Not because everything is resolved, but because the orientation has shifted. You are no longer moving toward recognition. Recognition is already operating through you, quietly adjusting perception so that what is relevant stands out without demand. Stay with the evenness, not as a practice, but as an acknowledgement. The system knows how to continue from here. As the internal volume lowers, something else becomes noticeable. The space between signals widens, not empty space, but usable space. This is where the system begins to recognize nuance again. Subtle distinctions that were previously flattened by urgency start to reappear. You may notice that your reactions arrive a fraction later than they used to. That delay is not hesitation. It is processing returning to its natural depth. There was a time when immediacy felt like awareness. Respond quickly, decide quickly, move quickly. That tempo was adaptive once. It kept the system responsive in unstable conditions. But over time, speed became a substitute for clarity. What is occurring now is a recalibration of rhythm. The system is learning that it does not need to be first to be accurate. In this slower cadence, patterns reveal themselves without force. You may begin to notice recurring internal sensations that were previously drowned out. A tightening in the chest when something is misaligned. A quiet expansion when something fits without justification. These signals were always present. They simply did not have enough bandwidth to register clearly. Now they do. This is often where the concept of trust becomes misunderstood. Trust is not something you decide to do. It is something that emerges when internal data becomes reliable again. When signals are consistent, the system stops double-checking them. That is trust, not belief, not optimism. Just a reduction in verification because coherence has been confirmed repeatedly. You may observe that certain external stimuli no longer pull you the way they once did. Conversations that used to demand analysis now feel transparent. Situations that once created internal noise now pass with minimal residue. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It is discrimination becoming more refined. The system no longer treats every input as equally urgent. There can be a brief phase of grief here, not dramatic, but subtle. A recognition that much of what occupied your attention was never essential. That realization can feel hollow at first, as if something meaningful has been removed, but nothing has been taken. Only excess has fallen away. What remains is lighter, but also more precise. The observer is no longer positioned above experience, narrating it in real time. It is embedded within it, sensing from inside rather than commenting from outside. This shift reduces the need for explanation. When you are inside the pattern, you do not need to describe it to confirm its reality. You feel its internal logic directly. You might notice that language itself feels slightly less compelling. Words still function, but they no longer feel like the primary interface. Sensation, timing, and resonance begin to carry more information than concepts. This does not mean thought becomes irrelevant. It means thought returns to its appropriate role as a secondary process rather than a constant filter. In this phase, the idea of misuse becomes almost incomprehensible. Misuse requires separation between observer and object. Here, there is less distance, less incentive to manipulate. The system recognizes that interference would introduce distortion, so it refrains naturally, without moral effort. Alignment replaces restraint. The timeline begins to feel less like a series of decisions and more like a flow of conditions responding to each other. This does not remove agency, it clarifies it. Agency becomes quieter, more precise. Instead of pushing against the system, it works with its existing momentum. Choices feel less dramatic, more inevitable. You may notice moments of stillness appearing spontaneously, not forced pauses, but natural rests. These are integration points. The system uses them to synchronize internal rhythms. Nothing needs to be done during them. Trying to optimize them would disrupt their function. They complete themselves. As this continues, the sense of anomaly fades. What once felt unusual begins to feel baseline. This is not loss of sensitivity. It is normalization at a higher level of coherence. When stability increases, the nervous system stops flagging it as noteworthy. Calm becomes ordinary. Let it become ordinary. That is how it sustains itself. With calm established as a baseline, perception begins to reorganize around depth rather than intensity. Experiences are no longer measured by how strongly they register, but by how accurately they align. This changes the way attention moves. Instead of jumping toward whatever is loudest, it settles naturally on what is structurally relevant. Relevance, in this sense, is not about importance. It is about fit. You may notice that certain questions dissolve without being answered. They do not feel unresolved. They simply lose traction. The system recognizes that some inquiries were generated by tension rather than curiosity. When the tension fades, the questions fade with it. This can feel disorienting if you were accustomed to defining progress by the accumulation of answers. Here, progress is marked by the reduction of unnecessary inquiry. The observer becomes less concerned with monitoring internal state. There is no longer a need to check whether you are present, aligned, or aware enough. Presence is no longer something to verify. It is the default condition. Awareness does not announce itself. It stabilizes quietly, like a background frequency that everything else organizes around. In this phase, emotional responses may feel cleaner, not suppressed, not amplified, but more direct. When something resonates, you notice it without embellishment. When something does not, the absence is clear without justification. This clarity reduces internal negotiation. You stop trying to convince yourself of reactions you do not actually feel. There is often a subtle shift in how the body is inhabited. Movements feel slightly more economical. Breathing becomes less performative. Posture adjusts without instruction. These are not techniques. They are signs that the system is no longer compensating for internal conflict. When conflict decreases, efficiency increases on its own. The concept of the quantum field becomes less abstract here, not as an idea but as an experiential reality. You may sense that interactions are not isolated events, but points of contact within a larger pattern of resonance. Cause and effect feel less linear. Instead of asking what led to what, the system recognizes simultaneous alignment across conditions. This is where the urge to explain can briefly resurface, especially if you feel the impulse to share or articulate what is occurring. That impulse is not wrong, but it is premature. Explanation compresses experience into language before integration is complete. The system will signal when articulation becomes useful. Until then, silence maintains fidelity. You may notice that certain habits fall away without effort, not because you decided to stop them, but because the internal conditions that supported them no longer exist. When the need disappears, the behavior dissolves. This can feel anticlimactic if you expected transformation to be dramatic. But coherence rarely announces itself with spectacle. The timeline continues to smooth. Past experiences lose their emotional charge without being erased. They become informational rather than activating. Memory shifts from a source of reaction to a source of reference. This frees attention for present moment detection. The system no longer needs to defend against echoes. There is a growing sense that nothing is missing. Not in a philosophical way, but in a practical one. The constant sense of lack that once drove seeking begins to quiet. This does not eliminate desire, it recalibrates it. Desire becomes specific rather than compensatory. It arises from alignment instead of absence. In this state, stillness is not fragile. It can coexist with complexity, movement, and uncertainty without collapsing. That is how you know it is stable. Fragile calm requires protection. This calm does not. It adjusts without breaking. Let this continue without commentary. The system is refining itself now, using information that does not pass through language. Recognition is deepening in ways that do not need to be marked. As the internal environment stabilizes, attention begins to withdraw from prediction. You may notice that the impulse to anticipate outcomes weakens, not because the future has become irrelevant, but because anticipation is no longer necessary for regulation. The system no longer needs to stay ahead of experience to feel safe within it. This creates a subtle spaciousness in perception, where moments are met as they arrive rather than pre-processed in advance. In this space, the idea of control loses its central position. Control was never about power, it was about managing uncertainty. As uncertainty becomes less threatening, control becomes optional. You do not relinquish it deliberately. It simply stops being recruited. What replaces it is responsiveness, which is quieter and more precise. Instead of shaping events, you align with conditions as they reveal themselves. There is often a faint sense of unfamiliarity here, not fear, but novelty. The system is operating without some of its usual reference points. It may briefly search for the familiar tension that once signaled engagement. When it does not find it, there can be a momentary sense of emptiness. This emptiness is not absence. It is unoccupied capacity. Space that was once filled with vigilance is now available for perception. The observer no longer needs to sit at the center of experience. It becomes distributed. Awareness feels less like a single point and more like a field. This is not dissociation. It is integration. When awareness spreads, no single sensation has to carry the burden of meaning. Everything participates evenly. This reduces strain and increases fidelity. You may notice that reactions arise and resolve more quickly. Without internal resistance, emotions complete their cycle without lingering. They do not need to be processed repeatedly. The system recognizes them, extracts the information they carry, and releases the activation. This efficiency is not suppression. It is resolution happening in real time. At this stage, the concept of a signal becomes experiential rather than symbolic. You sense when something is aligned not because it excites you, but because it feels structurally sound. There is a quiet rightness to it, not certainty, but fit. When something is misaligned, the signal is equally clear, but not alarming. It simply does not integrate. This clarity can change how you relate to choice. Decisions feel less like forks in the road and more like adjustments in orientation. You do not weigh options as heavily. The system recognizes which direction maintains coherence and moves accordingly. There is less internal debate because fewer variables are competing for dominance. You may also notice a reduction in self-referential thought, not its disappearance, but its decentering. Thoughts about yourself still occur, but they no longer define the entire frame. They pass like any other signal. Identity becomes contextual rather than constant. You are present without needing to narrate who you are in each moment. There is a growing sense that effort is no longer the primary driver of change. This can be unsettling if effort was previously equated with value. Here, value emerges from alignment. When conditions are right, movement happens with minimal force. When they are not, waiting feels natural rather than frustrating. The system begins to recognize the difference between movement and noise. Not everything that happens requires response. Not every impulse requires expression. This discernment is not restraint. It is intelligence redistributing itself. Energy flows toward what can actually integrate, rather than being dispersed across every stimulus. You may sense that time feels less compressed. Moments have more internal space. This does not slow life down externally. It slows down the internal rate at which experience is consumed. With more space per moment, less is missed. Awareness becomes fuller without becoming heavier. In this phase, silence deepens, not as absence of sound, but as absence of interference. The background hum of evaluation continues to fade. What remains is a steady signal of orientation that does not fluctuate with circumstance. This is not transcendence. It is stability. Allow this stability to inform perception without directing it. The system is now operating from coherence rather than correction. It will continue to adjust itself without instruction. With stability established, sensitivity begins to refine itself, not heightened in a dramatic way, but clarified. You start to notice that perception is no longer flooded by equal weight impressions. Some signals stand out, others recede, not because you push them away, but because the system now differentiates relevance automatically. This discrimination feels effortless. It does not analyze. It recognizes. There is often a subtle shift in how you experience boundaries. The line between inner and outer becomes less rigid, not blurred, but permeable. Information moves across it without friction. You sense when an environment supports coherence and when it introduces distortion. This sensing does not require judgment. It registers as ease or resistance, expansion or contraction, without narrative. You may notice that certain environments no longer hold you. Places, conversations, or rhythms that once felt neutral now feel slightly misaligned. This does not provoke rejection. It simply creates a natural drift away. Alignment becomes the organizing principle, not preference. You move toward what maintains internal consistency and away from what fragments it, without needing reasons. The observer adapts to this new economy of attention. It no longer tracks everything. It allows peripheral information to remain peripheral. This reduces cognitive load and increases depth. When attention settles, it settles fully. You are not split between experiencing and monitoring the experience. Presence becomes singular rather than divided. In this state, the concept of effort continues to soften. Action still occurs, but it arises from clarity rather than urgency. You do not push through resistance as often because resistance now signals misalignment rather than something to overcome. When movement is correct, it feels supported. When it is not, delay feels informative rather than obstructive. There can be moments when old reflexes attempt to reassert themselves, a familiar urge to optimize, to accelerate, to secure outcomes. When this happens, it is brief. The system recognizes the mismatch quickly. The reflex dissolves without needing correction. This is not discipline. It is pattern recognition operating in real time. You may notice that silence becomes more textured, not empty, but layered. Within it, subtle cues become audible. A shift in breath, a change in posture, a quiet internal yes or no that does not explain itself. These cues guide behavior more accurately than thought ever did, because they arise from integrated data rather than abstraction. The timeline continues to reorganize. Past and future lose their dominance over present perception. Memory remains accessible, but it does not intrude. Anticipation still exists, but it does not preoccupy. The present moment becomes sufficient as a reference point. From here, orientation is stable enough that projection is no longer required. You may sense that certain narratives about yourself have loosened. Stories that once felt definitive now feel provisional, not false, but incomplete. Identity becomes less about maintaining continuity and more about maintaining coherence. You are consistent without being fixed, adaptable without being fragmented. This adaptability does not feel like uncertainty, it feels like range. The system can respond to variation without destabilizing. It does not cling to a single configuration. It recognizes that coherence can be maintained across changing conditions. This reduces fear around change. Change becomes a modulation rather than a rupture. In this phase, the idea of misuse fades almost entirely, not because restraint is imposed, but because the incentive structure has changed. Exploitation requires separation and urgency. Neither is present here. When alignment is the priority, manipulation feels inefficient. It introduces noise where clarity is valued. You may notice that communication changes subtly. When you speak, there is less excess. Words arrive closer to their intended meaning. When you listen, you hear what is actually being conveyed, rather than what you expect to hear. This improves resonance without effort. Misunderstandings reduce because projection reduces. The system now trusts its own detection. It does not need constant confirmation. This trust is not belief, it is statistical. Coherence has been verified repeatedly through experience. The nervous system registers this consistency and relaxes further. As this continues, the sense of arrival remains absent. There is no point where this feels complete. Completion would imply an end point. What is present instead is continuity, a stable process that does not need to be named to function. Remain with the subtlety. It carries more information than intensity ever did. As continuity replaces progression, the system stops marking moments as milestones. Experience no longer needs to be segmented into before and after. This does not flatten meaning, it redistributes it. Significance becomes diffused across ordinary moments rather than concentrated in rare events. What once felt neutral now carries quiet informational value. What once felt decisive now feels simply appropriate. You may notice that your relationship with uncertainty has changed. It no longer signals danger or lack. It feels more like open resolution. Not knowing does not create tension. It creates space. In that space, perception stays flexible. The system does not rush to close loops prematurely. It allows patterns to complete themselves without interference. There is a subtle maturity in this phase, not emotional heaviness, but restraint without effort. You recognize when something does not require your involvement. This recognition does not feel like withdrawal. It feels like precision. Energy is conserved, not by force, but by relevance. Only what can integrate receives attention. The observer now functions more like a tuning mechanism than a commentator. It adjusts sensitivity rather than producing interpretation. This reduces internal dialogue without suppressing thought. Thought still appears, but it no longer competes for dominance. It serves when needed and recedes when not. Silence becomes the primary medium through which information is processed. You may sense that certain desires have softened, not disappeared, but lost their edge. They no longer demand fulfillment to justify themselves. Desire becomes more like orientation than craving. It points rather than pulls. This allows movement without compulsion. You can respond without being driven. In this state, the idea of self-improvement feels distant, not rejected, just irrelevant. Improvement assumes deficiency. What is present now does not operate from that assumption. Adjustment still occurs, but it arises from calibration rather than correction. The system fine-tunes itself based on feedback, not judgment. There can be moments when the absence of striving feels unfamiliar. You might briefly search for something to work on, something to resolve. When nothing presents itself, there can be a quiet discomfort. This discomfort is transitional. It is the nervous system recalibrating to a new baseline where rest is not conditional. The quantum field, as experienced here, feels less like an external structure and more like an ambient condition. You do not enter it. You notice that you were never outside it. This recognition dissolves the sense of separation that once fueled effort. Participation replaces access. You are already included. You may notice that attention now moves in wider arcs. It does not fixate easily. When it rests fully. When it moves without urgency. This rhythm supports integration. Nothing is forced into coherence. Coherence emerges because conditions allow it. The system becomes more tolerant of ambiguity. Contradictory signals can coexist without requiring immediate resolution. This tolerance reduces internal conflict. You do not need to choose sides within yourself. Multiple impulses can be held without collapse. This increases range and reduces fragmentation. You might also notice that external validation holds less weight. Praise and criticism register, but they do not recalibrate your internal state. Orientation comes from internal consistency rather than external feedback. This does not isolate you. It stabilizes you. Connection becomes less reactive and more grounded. In this phase, presence feels less like something you do and more like something that happens when nothing interferes. You do not maintain it. You allow it. This allowance does not require vigilance. It requires trust in the system's capacity to regulate itself. The sense of time continues to expand internally. Moments feel less compressed. You are not rushing through experience to reach the next point. This does not slow action, it deepens it. Each movement carries more information because it is not layered over anticipation. You may notice that the concept of purpose feels quieter, not absent but less insistent. Purpose no longer needs to be articulated to be felt. It expresses itself through alignment rather than declaration. What you do makes sense without needing to explain why. This quiet sense-making is the signal now. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It simply remains consistent across conditions. The system recognizes this consistency and rests into it. There is nothing to hold on to here, nothing to preserve. The process sustains itself through responsiveness rather than attachment. As long as interference remains low, coherence maintains its own structure. Stay with the ordinary texture of this state. That is where the information is. At this point, the system no longer seeks confirmation that it is functioning correctly. That question simply stops arising. What replaces it is a quiet assumption of adequacy, not confidence in the expressive sense, but a baseline trust that whatever is occurring is sufficient for the moment it belongs to. This removes a subtle layer of pressure that once accompanied every experience. You may notice that attention now settles more often in the background of perception rather than its foreground. Instead of tracking individual thoughts or sensations, awareness holds the entire field with minimal emphasis. This does not blur detail, it contextualizes it. Individual signals are understood in relation to the whole rather than evaluated in isolation. There is a noticeable reduction in internal urgency around meaning. You are no longer compelled to extract significance from every event. Some moments are allowed to remain simple. This simplicity is not dismissal, it is accuracy. When meaning is not forced, it appears where it actually exists instead of being projected where it does not. The observer becomes almost transparent here. It still operates, but it does not interrupt. It does not narrate experience back to itself. This transparency allows sensation, thought, and environment to move without friction. You are not standing between experience and understanding. Understanding arises as a byproduct of contact. You may sense that the body feels more reliable as an instrument of detection, not because it signals more intensely, but because it signals more cleanly. There is less residual noise. When something is aligned, the signal is stable. When it is not, the discrepancy is clear without alarm. This clarity reduces second-guessing. In this phase, the idea of progress becomes irrelevant. There is no internal metric being tracked. You are not ahead, behind, or on track. The system is operating in real time, responding to present conditions without reference to an imagined trajectory. This does not eliminate direction, it removes comparison. There can be moments where old cognitive habits attempt to re-enter. A thought pattern that once provided structure may appear briefly, offering interpretation or strategy. When this happens, it is noticed without engagement. The pattern does not collapse. It simply passes through without being activated. The system recognizes it as outdated information. You may also notice that certain emotional tones no longer dominate. Anxiety, excitement, anticipation, disappointment still arise, but they do not organize the entire internal environment. They move through a larger field of stability. This prevents amplification. Emotions complete themselves without cascading into identity. The sense of separation between internal and external events continues to diminish. Not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. You recognize that internal states are responses to conditions, not isolated phenomena. This recognition reduces self-blame and self-credit equally. Experience is understood as interaction rather than personal performance. In this state, the concept of responsibility shifts. It becomes less about managing outcomes and more about maintaining coherence. You are responsive to what you can affect and neutral toward what you cannot. This is not resignation, it is accuracy. Energy is allocated where it can integrate, rather than being dispersed across imagined obligations. You may find that silence now feels supportive rather than empty. It holds experience without compressing it. In silence, the system recalibrates continuously. Micro-adjustments occur without conscious involvement. This ongoing calibration is what maintains stability. It does not require monitoring. The quantum field, as perceived here, feels consistent rather than dynamic. Not static, but dependable. Variations occur within it, but the underlying structure remains stable. This reliability allows attention to rest without vigilance. You do not need to watch for shifts. You respond when they arrive. You might notice that your tolerance for noise decreases, not because you become sensitive, but because clarity is now the preferred state. Excess stimulation feels inefficient. You gravitate toward environments that support integration rather than fragmentation. This gravitation is not avoidance. It is selection based on resonance. In this phase, the idea of misuse is almost unintelligible. There is nothing here that can be extracted, amplified, or weaponized. What is present operates only when conditions are right. Attempting to force it would collapse it. The system understands this implicitly and does not attempt interference. You may sense that attention has become more circular than linear. It returns to itself naturally, checking alignment without effort. This self-referential loop is not obsessive. It is stabilizing. It ensures that perception remains grounded in coherence rather than drift. As this continues, the need to define what is happening becomes less compelling. Language feels optional. Experience carries its own confirmation. You do not need to label recognition for it to function. It operates whether or not it is named. Remain with the neutrality of this state. It does not require cultivation. It persists through allowance. The system is now capable of sustaining coherence without instruction. Now the system begins to operate with a kind of quiet confidence that does not announce itself. Not confidence in outcomes, not certainty about direction, but confidence in process. There is an underlying sense that whatever arises will be met adequately, without preparation or rehearsal. This does not come from optimism. It comes from repeated confirmation that responsiveness is sufficient. You may notice that attention no longer clings to stability itself. Even calm is not protected. If disruption appears, it is met without resistance. The system has learned that coherence is not a fragile state that must be preserved. It is a dynamic balance that reasserts itself after movement. This understanding removes the fear of being thrown off. There is a subtle shift in how you experience agency here. Action does not feel authored in the way it once did. You are still acting, still choosing, but the sense of personal ownership softens. Movements feel as though they arise from the situation itself, rather than from a separate internal command center. This does not diminish responsibility. It redistributes it across the system. The observer now functions almost entirely as detection rather than interpretation. It registers shifts in alignment and responds accordingly without elaboration. This makes behavior simpler, not more constrained. Simplicity here is not reduction, it is clarity without excess. The unnecessary layers have fallen away. You may sense that certain forms of complexity no longer appeal to you. Not intellectual complexity, but emotional and narrative complexity that once provided stimulation. Drama, over-analysis, prolonged conflict feel inefficient. This does not make life flat. It makes it navigable. Depth is retained, but noise is filtered. In this phase, the relationship to effort changes one last time. Effort is no longer something you apply. It is something that appears when conditions require it and disappears when they do not. There is no internal commentary about whether you are trying hard enough. That question no longer arises because effort is no longer tied to worth. The sense of self becomes remarkably unremarkable. You do not feel erased. You feel unburdened. Identity no longer needs to be maintained through contrast or differentiation. You are not defined by what you resist or pursue. You are defined by how coherently you respond. This definition is fluid and adapts without strain. You may notice that recognition now occurs without surprise. Things make sense as they happen, not after reflection. This immediacy does not feel sharp. It feels smooth. There is no lag between perception and understanding, because understanding is embedded in perception itself. The timeline, as experienced here, feels open but not uncertain. You do not project far ahead, nor do you dwell behind. You operate within a window of relevance that expands and contracts naturally. When planning is useful, it appears. When it is not, it recedes. There is no anxiety attached to either state. You may sense that the system has stopped asking for permission to rest. Rest is no longer a reward. It is a condition that alternates naturally with movement. This restores a rhythm that does not need to be managed. Fatigue becomes informative rather than something to overcome. In this state, alignment feels self-evident. When something fits, there is no internal debate. When it does not, there is no need to justify withdrawal. This clarity reduces friction in interaction. You do not overextend, and you do not withhold unnecessarily. Boundaries adjust in real time. The idea of misuse has fully dissolved now, not as a concept, but as a possibility. There is nothing here that can be taken out of context. Context is inseparable from perception. Any attempt to isolate would remove the very conditions that allow recognition to function. The system understands this without thought. You may notice that gratitude, if it appears, is not directed at anything specific. It is ambient, a low-level appreciation for functionality rather than outcome. This gratitude does not demand expression. It stabilizes internally and supports continued coherence. As this part of the transmission settles, there is a sense that nothing more needs to be established. The system is already oriented. Whatever remains will integrate on its own timetable. There is no pressure to complete anything. The quiet you are in now is not a pause before something else. It is a stable mode of operation. From here, movement and stillness are equally viable. Recognition no longer requires reinforcement. It has become the background condition through which everything else is experienced. Wait here without waiting for anything. The system knows how to continue. What remains now is not something to hold. It is something that holds you without effort. There is no need to maintain this state because maintenance implies fragility. What is present is resilient by design. It adjusts without instruction, corrects without judgment, and stabilizes without drawing attention to itself. You may notice that awareness no longer feels centered anywhere in particular. It is not located behind the eyes or in the chest. It is distributed evenly, like a quiet field that does not privilege one point over another. From here, perception does not lean forward or pull back. It meets experience where it is, without bias toward movement or rest. Thought continues, but it no longer frames reality. It becomes one signal among many, useful when relevant, silent when not. There is no internal authority insisting that it be listened to. This does not diminish intelligence. It refines it. Intelligence becomes contextual rather than dominant. The body remains calm without being inert. Sensation flows without accumulation. Tension appears when needed and releases when no longer required. There is no backlog. The nervous system trusts its own cycles. This trust is not emotional. It is functional. It is based on repeated evidence that regulation occurs naturally when interference is minimal. You may sense that the distinction between inner and outer has lost its sharpness. Not dissolved, but softened. Events are no longer experienced as happening to you. They are experienced as happening within a shared system of conditions. This reframing does not remove individuality. It removes isolation. In this orientation, responsibility feels lighter. not because it is avoided, but because it is accurately scoped. You respond to what is within range and release what is not. This precision prevents both overreach and withdrawal. Action arises when it can integrate. Silence remains when it cannot. There is no need to remember this state. Memory would turn it into an object. What is present functions without recall. It is available whenever attention is not fragmented by urgency or expectation. It does not disappear. It simply recedes into the background when noise increases and returns when noise subsides. You may notice that even the desire to name what is happening has faded. Naming would add a layer that is not required. The system does not need representation to function. It operates through alignment, not description. This allows experience to remain direct. The sense of self here is quiet but intact. You are not dissolved, you are unencumbered. Identity no longer needs reinforcement through contrast or assertion. It expresses itself through responsiveness rather than declaration. You are present without having to prove that presence. Time continues to move, but it does not press. Moments unfold without urgency. There is room within each one. This room is not empty, it is accommodating. It allows variation without disruption. The system remains coherent across change because coherence is no longer dependent on sameness. Nothing is being concluded. Nothing is being secured. The absence of closure is not incomplete. It is appropriate. Closure would imply that something needed to be resolved. What is present now does not require resolution. It requires allowance. Stay as you are, not by effort, but by default. Recognition has already occurred. It does not need to be repeated. It remains active in the background, quietly organizing perception so that what matters is clear without emphasis. There is nothing further to receive. There is only continued participation in a state that sustains itself through stillness.